I'd like to welcome you to this Palestinian Awareness Seminar evening. This is organized by the Surrey University's Islamic Society in conjunction with the PRC, Palestinian Return Center, and the PSC, Palestine Solidarity Campaign. I'll take a few minutes of your time and then I'll introduce our speakers today and I'll hand over to them there. The United Nations General Assembly adopted the Convention on the Prevention of and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in 1948. At the time, we all know who the framers of the convention had in mind. They had in mind the victims of the atrocities committed by the Nazis across Europe. In particular, the Jewish victims of the Holocaust during World War II. Those Jewish victims now find themselves represented by the State of Israel, a state that claims to speak on behalf of all the Jews in the world. The framers of the convention adopted it to make sure that no such actions would take place or go unpunished ever again. Yet, strangely, the State of Israel at this time in age is the perpetrator of similar crimes against another group of people, innocent people, the Palestinians. Just one example, the siege on Gaza at the minute is still going on. It's imposed on 1.5 million people, half of which are under the age of 18, children in the eye-flow. 750 children are under siege in the name of security. They are jailed, basically in what is essentially the biggest jail in the world. We can talk about the history of Palestine, the Nakba, the disposition. It might be depressing to many, but what I would like to say today, I am more optimistic than ever. I am more hopeful that change will come. What's happening now in Tunisia and in Egypt is a peaceful, unarmed awakening, uprising, revolution of the people, of the youth in the Middle East. A new Middle East is coming. A new Middle East is emerging, courtesy of the street, no thanks to the USA. A change is coming for real this time, Mr. Obama. Israel will no longer enjoy the scared neighboring nations who are only busy with their breadwinning. Now, they are busy with democracy, human rights, and freedom. Our first speaker of the night today will talk about the history of the conflict. Mr. Sami Habib, who is going to talk about the history of the conflict, he is a Palestinian journalist from Gaza Strip. He is a journalist and a blogger and the founder of the Palestine Telegraph. Please welcome.
My presentation tonight is titled Palestine History, People and the Land. I'll be focusing on some myth that's being adopted by Israelis, some primer on history, key issues, and life in Palestine these days. So the first myth is Palestine and Palestinians never existed. One of the sayings that former Israeli Prime Minister said, like Golda Meir, she said that there was no such thing as Palestinians, while the other Prime Minister, Menachem Begin, said Palestinians are two-legged firm. Other Prime Ministers said many things about Palestinians and denied their existence, although Palestinians have existed long time for the Jews. We know that Palestinians lived, and this is good to know, they've lived in the land, the Canaanites, long time ago, thousands of years ago. In later stages, the Jews migrated from some neighboring Arab countries. They were in these areas. They migrated to Palestine. In later stages, they were out of Palestine for some problems with some of the civilizations that invaded Palestine. So there were some groups of people who migrated from one place to another, like others. They were not having a bond with these lands. They were not having historical tie with these lands. So they were kind of migrants who came for a while and then left. That's their link with the Palestinian land. But later on, what we see is they are trying to say that the land is theirs, while the Palestinians never existed. So it's blanket of dehumanization of people used as a propaganda tactic. Israel has devoted enormous energy to expel Palestinians from their homes, strip away the Palestinian identity, deny Palestinians' existence. The problem in the recent time started when, first of all, Napoleon Bonaparte offered the Jewish movement, national movement in Europe, homeland, which is Palestine. And then later on, Herzl and his own journal suggested that the Jewish people should have homeland. He was suggesting Uganda, Argentina, and Palestine, and some other places. Practically speaking, in 1882, from 1882 to 1903, more than 30,000 Jews migrated from Europe to Palestine. The number of the Jews in Palestine in the 18th century was less than like dozens of families. But by the time they started to migrate into Palestine, until the very direct waves of migrants started to flood into Palestine with the support of the British mandate, which really played a very key role in bringing the Jews into Palestine and kicking the Palestinians out of their homes. Even with when those British left Palestine, they've given most of their weapons, they've given the control directly to the Israeli gangs, between two brackets. Those Israeli gangs have started in 1947, 1948 to ethnically cleanse Palestinians who've been living in that land for a long time. As you see, this chart is explaining by date how the Israelis or the Jews came from Europe and started to flood into Palestine from 1870 to 1946. I don't want to explain by details because time is going to be short for us. Let's move directly to the other slide. The other slide is also giving us more details on the number of Arabs and Jews and how they were migrating waves after waves. And this also is like a kind of debuncation, or to debunk the Israeli allegation that the Palestinian never existed. No Palestinian existed, and these are showing us how the number of the Jews started to increase day after day. So question it, guys. If Palestinians never existed, why do Israeli leaders refer to those Palestinians in their own diaries and statements? If Palestinians never existed in Palestine, why they should say such of the statements that I've showed you in the early start? But no, there were Palestinians there, they were in their own land. But those leaders, they came from Europe, from Poland, East Europe specifically. Those waves came from East Europe, thousands of migrants, especially after the Second World War, when more than 174,000 Jews came from Europe in the first wave, and the second wave included more than 130,000 came to Palestine. But before this, there were waves and waves of migrants coming into Palestine. If Palestinians never existed in Palestine, why we have kind of resources? I mean, we have resources, documents, shows that we've been there. It was our land, and we have the resources. Some of the photos later on will show you how we have existed. So some of these photos are showing, this photo, for example, is showing that they're in Palestine, and there were some photos, that there was some factories in Palestine for buses, and this also shows in Jaffa, 1923, like a soccer team, and also there was a school here, and also there were some farmers, there were scout teams in Palestine, school in 1924. We were there, we were having culture, we were having civilization that was ethnically cleansed with the people later on. The other myth that Israelis are all the time saying when they come to debate someone or speak is that Palestinians choose to leave their land, that we left Palestine without a reason in 1948. They said that massacres never took place, that Palestinians left quickly without telling them just leave. They've left with their own will, which is a lie. They said the Palestinians left with their own will, and the other one is saying that they were encouraged to leave by Arab leaders. 68% of the Palestinians left without ever seeing an Israeli soldier. But on the other hand, it was a war that they lost, they say as well. Population exchange, they said some of the Jews were expelled from Arab countries and then they came to Palestine. Although the Jews were not expelled from these Arab countries. And that's a propaganda being launched these days. I've seen an article in The Guardian recently by Danny Ayalon from the Israel Foreign Ministry, who was defending the Jewish right to return in the Arab countries. There is nothing called the Jewish right to return in the Arab countries. The only right to return these days is the Palestinian right of return that we have really to defend and to work towards implementation for this right. There is nothing called the Jewish right to return. Those Jewish people, they were Arab countries, they were living in peace, but when the Zionist movements started to establish its own state in Palestine, they started to make some terrorism actions in Iraq and in Egypt, and they've started to explode some cinemas and some key places that the Jews own. So this was a direct reason that those Jews left the Arab countries and then they migrated to Palestine. That's one of the reasons and the techniques that was followed. And there was the other technique, which is the Holocaust. All was scared, so they have come to Palestine later on. So the reality is Palestinians were largely defenseless in 1948. When the Palestinians, when the Nakba took place in 1948, we were defenseless people. There was no proper Palestinian state, okay? There was a culture, civilization, but there was no army, there was no proper state. On the other side, Israeli gangs, as I told you earlier, the British mandate, when it has finished, they've given everything to the Israelis, the weapons, the power, and all official sides, including the weapons, the airplanes. So they have used directly these things against us. But on the other side, the Palestinians were having a few light weapons like rifles and other ammunitions. So basically that the Palestinians never relinquished their lands, or they've given up this easily. They were expelled, they were forced to leave, and Ian Pape said many times, and other Israeli writers, that those people were ethnically cleansed. Okay, they were forced to leave, they were killed, they were massacred, their houses, villages destroyed, around 500 villages were destroyed. People did not leave voluntarily. When they have had this danger, they were pushed to leave to the neighboring countries. So this is the number, 419 to 531 Arab villages were demolished in that time. This means 4 villages per week. They were really working hard towards expelling those Palestinians by all the means they had. So question it, guys. As I said earlier, why would people want to leave their homes and towns if there was no danger, as the Israelis said? Why, for example, you're just living here in Guildford, just sitting in peace, and why do you think you will just migrate without a reason? Do you think this is like logic? It's not logic, okay? The reason that you are leaving is that there's a danger, there's something that's coming towards you. And this is what happened in Palestine. Those people were living freely, peacefully, until those Zionist gangs came with their weapons, took over, occupied this land, killed these people, so they were pushed to leave into the neighboring countries. More than 800,000 Palestinians lived in that year. The other myth that the Israelis are using is that it's a religious war that has been taking place for a year. Okay, it's a Christian, Muslim, and Jewish war, but this is another lie. Jewish, Christians, and Muslims lived in peace for a long time. When the Muslims came to Palestine and the Umayyad Charter, the Uqda al-Umayyad took place, this charter gave the opportunity for Christians, Muslims, and Jews to worship God within Jerusalem freely without anything. Also, if you could go back to history and see, for example, in Spain, how the Muslims were treating Jews. There was nothing, But this is only a scapegoat for the Israelis to use whenever they are under pressure. Palestinians are the ones who reject peace. Oh yeah, Yasser Arafat was negotiating with Ehud Barak before 2000, and we guys like have given you the best offer ever, which is like 95% of the land. But those guys, when they tell us about these things in the media, they give us the headlines. They don't give us the details. In details, always you will find the devil, which is the lies here. They didn't tell us that really. They didn't tell us about the nature of. We're busy, man.
It's not my computer, guys.
It's the other eye, man. So within these headlines, you will see the details that they've tried, okay, to give us, as they say, 95%, which is a lie, but 95% out of 22 of Palestine, which is less than half of the land that we own it. And there would be more conditions on this. For example, the administrative control over some Palestinian neighborhoods around Jerusalem. They will give us a small state, and they will have the army on our borders. So it's not a state. It's not a state. They will have the control. It's a lie. So the reality is no freedom, no independence for the Palestinians, no offers from those Israelis. Those Israelis are not interested either in one-state solution or two-state solution. Those Israelis are interested, in my own view, and I guess some of you think or believe in this, some do not, they're interested in one solution, which is driving Palestinians out of Palestine into Jordan, and this is the very preferable choice that all the time is being adopted by the very rightist Israeli Foreign Minister, Avigdor Lieberman, who's advocating this choice at the moment, and he's working towards implementing this. And even he's also working towards the exchange of the cities if there is a possible Palestinian state. For example, some Palestinian cities within the so-called Israel with some settlements in the West Bank. This also gives us a hint how racist is this country. How come a country could give up, if it's a country, proper country, give up some cities, like a bunch of people, thousands and hundreds of thousands, will exchange them with another like neighborhood. This is like, it's illogic. It's totally illogic. So our lands, Palestine, Gaza Strip, the West Bank, it's no land, it's not country, it's not a state. It's like a prison. The continued building of the settlements, the checkpoints, and the roads are taking place. And the roads in the West Bank are very unique. You will never hear something about the roads like what is going in the West Bank. There is something called the only Jewish roads in the West Bank. This shows how racist and apartheid is this country. The only Jewish roads. The Jews, the settlers in the West Bank are allowed only to use these roads. If Palestinians will cross into these roads, they will be imprisoned or they will be fired at by the Israeli soldiers. There are more than 600 checkpoints. We hear these days that, okay, that there is this government in Ramallah, Salam Fayyad, yeah, he's building a Palestinian state, blah, blah, blah. All these are lies, you know, guys. They are telling, oh, yeah, he's building a state. There's more like institutions now. Yeah, and Israelis are lifting these checkpoints. This is lies. There are more than 600 checkpoints in the West Bank. And there's also something called the petrol checkpoints. Quickly, like a group of Israeli soldiers come with some cars. They come into this road and they make a checkpoint. Then you will have thousands of Palestinians queuing in these checkpoints, like waiting to cross into their cities, into their schools, and at the end of the day, they will fail. This is part of what we suffer in the West Bank. There is no real sovereignty on the borders or any kind of control. It's only by the hand of the Israelis. Or no control over the water or the airspace, no contiguous land. How come you will establish a country like Gaza Strip in the West Bank without a bond, without like a street even to link this land together? There was something before 2000s in which a Palestinian had a chance to move between Gaza and the West Bank, and it was really like very humiliating for us. 2 minutes? Oh gosh. Okay, I'll try to recap in 2 minutes. So we had no chance really to use this. For me, for my friend, and some other friends in Gaza, we don't know what is the West Bank like. We've never been to the West Bank. We were born 25, 26 years ago. We don't know what is going on in the West Bank. We don't know the people, our people. We don't know them because Israelis are not allowing us easily. I'll move to the other myth, Israel is democracy. Do you think Israel is a democracy and the only democracy in the Middle East? I guess by what is happening in Egypt, in Tunisia, next in Yemen, and next in other Arab countries, I guess it will not be the only democracy. Or let's say it's already not a democracy, it's a hypocrisy. That's what I always, all the time say. Israel claims to be the only democracy in the Middle East. Israel is a civilized country within this like uncivilized Middle East. Israeli Palestinians have equality in terms of its rights within Israel. It's all about lies. Where's democracy? Israel is law of return, and you've seen the documentary. If you are a Jew coming to Palestine, you will get the citizenship immediately. What about those Palestinians who were living in Palestine a long time ago? They would never get it. Is that democracy? Is that equality? No, it's not. It's lies. No defined borders. So this democracy does not want to limit its borders. They are continuing, building more settlements, occupying more lands, pulling it from this area, attacking this country. Israel have attacked more than 5 countries within 62 years. Israel have launched these 6 wars and even more against these five countries. Do you think Israel is a pacifist? A democracy could launch such a number of wars? That's a lie as well. So against Palestinians, there was also apartheid within the state of Israel. Palestinians do not have the rights. They are being treated with racist Israeli policies. Last is what is going on now. If they will celebrate the Nakba, they would be in troubles. So there are key issues. I'm going to finish now because time is running, which is very vital issues because I believe this presentation needs more time. The key issues are right of return, illegal settlements, war occupation, water, and other key issues. But I want to finish my presentation by stressing on the right of return. Palestinians were kicked and ethnically cleansed from the lands, and the international law guarantees that they should be returning to their home. UN resolutions affirmed on this, many resolutions by the Security Council, and after that, more than 110 resolutions from the General Assembly came to confirm and affirm on these resolutions to be implemented by the US, most of the time using the veto, and Israelis are not doing anything helpful to bring about peace in the Middle East. I believe I will be contradicting my friend Ayman. He's optimistic and hopeful, but I'm very pessimistic when it comes to the conflict. Neither one-state solution is factual, nor two-state solution. I guess maybe the region is going to war. That's my own analysis. Hopefully it's not. Hopefully, like, we will be returning to Palestine very soon, having our land back, and owning it the way that we have owned it in the past. Thanks for giving me the chance. I wish I could have more.
Thank you, Sam. I've just been informed that one of our speakers today is not going to be able to make it for personal reasons, Sarah Colborne. So I just apologize for that. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Paul Troop, who is a barrister, and he's an experienced public speaker on the topic of international law. He worked in the occupied territories and at the War Crimes Tribunal. Please.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Paul Troop. I'm a barrister. I practice mainly in London, but I also practice international law in The Hague. So I practiced at the Yugoslav Tribunal, Criminal Tribunal for the Former Yugoslavia, and I also practice at the International Criminal Court. I have been given the topic of talking about Palestine and international law, and unfortunately I've only been given 30 minutes. So I think there will be something of a limit to what I can talk about. So what I'll talk about will be quite simplified, I'm afraid. But I hope it's enough to give you some idea and some flavour of some of the main legal topics which are relevant to the conflict. I'll also be concentrating substantially on what's happened since 1967. Obviously, what went before then is also very important, but there has to be a bit of a limit to what I'm going to concentrate on. The next thing I say as well is that I'm a practicing lawyer, and what I thought would be more interesting for you was, rather than reciting what the law says and all the different resolutions, the treaties, I thought I'd give you a perspective from a practicing lawyer to give you an idea of how the law works in practice. And if we've got time, I'd like to compare it to another situation, which I think is one of the many comparable situations, and that's of the former Yugoslavia, because there are quite a few similarities with situations in the former Yugoslavia, and there are quite a few differences in the way the law has either been upheld or not upheld between the two situations. Chose those two topics mainly because those are two topics which I'm quite familiar with and which I've practiced in. So that's the perspective. So the first thing, I think, and I'm sure there'll be lawyers among you who will be very familiar with the law, also individuals who've practiced or studied international politics, so they know about the international situation. The international system is obviously very different from a domestic system. An international system of law isn't like a domestic system, or it isn't as clear-cut as a domestic system. You don't have a clear government, you don't have a clear legislature, you don't have a policeman, you don't have an army necessarily. So it's often the case that in much of international law, what the law is uncertain. However, particularly in relation to many of the key points, and the key points about the Israel-Palestine situation, the situation is surprisingly clear. It's very definite, at least the principles are, but what is uncertain is the implementation. And particularly with international law, and particularly with the Israel-Palestine situation, what the principles are becomes very, very political. It's always possible for a lawyer to present an argument one way or the other. It's always possible for a politician to present law one perspective one way or the other. But the question is, what is a reasonable position to hold? And the position which people take, whether they accept the international principles or not, very much depends on their own political system, or their own political perspective. So you probably wouldn't be surprised that those on the right wing of Israeli politics would be less inclined to accept some of these key principles. But coming from a perspective of someone who doesn't come from the region, doesn't favour one side or the other, and comes from a perspective of a practicing lawyer, applying these principles in domestic courts, in international courts, from my perspective, I think actually the principles are accepted pretty widely among most international lawyers who aren't politically motivated. Before I talk about history and some of the key principles, I just want to put some of the main bodies which I'll talk about in the frame, so you know. I'm sure you do all know something about them. Obviously, one of the key ones is the Security Council. The Security Council is a bit like a kind of world executive, and it's made of some of the main world powers which won the Second World War, plus a rotating membership of other countries. But the key point is that the 5 main members, or permanent members of the Council, essentially have a veto. So if one of them really doesn't like something that's being proposed, they can veto it, and it never becomes binding in any way. Now, if a Security Council resolution is passed, and there are different levels of resolution, but in theory it's supposed to be binding, particularly if it's reached under Chapter 7, because that authorises the use of force. That's the situation in principle. The second body, which is very relevant, is the United Nations General Assembly. And this could be compared in many respects to like world legislature. Each country is represented and has an entitlement to sit in the General Assembly. But unlike the Security Council, its resolutions are not necessarily binding, but they can form part of evidence as to what international law is. And you'll find that actually the General Assembly resolutions, probably by virtue of the fact that each state has one vote, they tend to reflect more accurately what the general opinion of lawyers is about what the law is. However, it's very difficult for those resolutions to be translated into any kind of political action without anything else. Then we have the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice is essentially the world court, and it can rule on disputes between states, and it can also produce advisory opinions. And one of the advisory opinions, which you no doubt have heard about, is that concerning the wall in the West Bank. Again, in principle, what the International Court of Justice states is a binding interpretation of international law, but that doesn't necessarily translate into action or implementation. And then the next, or one of the key bodies of international law would be, in theory, some kind of executive arm or police or military that would implement what the international body said. And although it's envisaged that there will be an international military force for the United Nations in the UN Charter, no military force has ever been put together. So those are the main bodies. Next, we come to the history. And we will get to the law, I promise. I'm sure you're all very familiar with the history, but I just want to touch on some very key points because they're relevant to what I will say next. So, I'm sure one of my learned speakers has touched on the situation 1948, pre-1948, but I'd just like to touch on the situation before 1967, and that was after the State of Israel had been created, and where two main areas of land were still not under Israeli control. There was the West Bank, controlled by Jordan, and there was Gaza, controlled by Egypt. And in 1967, following an armed conflict, Israel took control of both the West Bank and Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And since that time, it's maintained that military occupation. And also at the same time, it has been moving civilians into the occupied areas in the form of settlements. It's also annexed East Jerusalem and treats East Jerusalem as part of Israel proper and part of the capital of Israel. More recently, in the early 2000s, Israel started constructing a wall in the West Bank. And I'm sure you've heard that rather than going along the Green Line, which was the border which separated pre-1967 Israel from the lands occupied in 1967, rather than building a wall along that border, as would be the internationally recognised border, the wall snakes very severely inside the West Bank and takes into account settlements, and because of its winding route, has the effect of cutting off large sections of the West Bank from each other, and making little cut-off cantons, which are very difficult to access. That is a very, very basic, very, very simplified sketch of the situation to date. So just moving on to, well, what are the relevant or key, I can't cover all of them, what are the key legal principles? Well, firstly, and this is quite well established, and probably doesn't surprise any of you, is the annexation of land by force is not in accordance with international law. So any attempt by any state, and Israel of course isn't the only state to try to do these things, any attempt by any state to take land by force is contrary to international law. That's quite well established. Next, the status of the West Bank and Gaza. The generally recognised status of the West Bank and Gaza is that they are under a military occupation in accordance with international humanitarian law. international humanitarian law rather than an internal situation. So that means the principles of international armed conflict are applicable to the occupation. And conflicts within, between Israel and Gaza, for example, caste-led, they amount to an international armed conflict also. And what that means is there are certain requirements which a state has to abide by when they're conducting hostilities or even treating the population of occupied land. First, there are basic requirements about the conduct of armed hostilities. And there are many, and I'll only concentrate on a few of them because they were principles which were pretty clearly flouted, it seems to be the case, at least from the Goldstone report and other reports. The first was that you cannot intentionally target civilians. That goes for anybody really. It goes for a suicide bomber inside Israel, or it goes for the Israeli army conducting hostilities in the West Bank or Gaza or anywhere else for that matter. You cannot deliberately target civilians. You can target military targets, and you can target combatants. But what you can't do when you're targeting combatants, you cannot use disproportionate force. Disproportionate force is a very subjective question, obviously. But basically it means that you can't use a sledgehammer to crack a nut. So if there is one combatant who you want to target, but they're in the vicinity of a school, and targeting them would affect the school, then that would be a disproportionate attack. You can't transfer civilians into occupied territory. So the transfer of civilians into occupied territory by way of the settlements is contrary to international humanitarian law. There are many other aspects of international humanitarian law, but the key principle, or one of the key principles, is that the breach of those principles isn't just a breach of international law. What it amounts to is a war crime. And war crimes are crimes of universal jurisdiction, which in theory can be punished by any country, anywhere, wherever they took place. The next set of principles which applies are the human rights principles. And I'm sure we're all familiar with basic principles of human rights. They're the kind of most fundamental guarantees that we all consider to be the most important guarantees of the way we want to live our life. And the International Court of Justice, when it gave an opinion on the war, which I'll come into in a little bit of detail, confirmed that even in occupied territories where military law applies or international humanitarian law applies, human rights law also applies. So in addition to the requirements of conducting hostilities in a certain way, the occupying power also has an obligation to ensure that those subject to its occupation have the appropriate levels of human rights protection. There are very many of those: right to free movement, prohibition on arbitrary detention, even basic rights like food, water, health. Very straightforward and very common rights which are enjoyed by most people in the rest of the Western world, at least. Coming on to the ruling which I mentioned earlier, there was a ruling by the International Court of Justice, and this arose because of the construction by Israel of this wall in the West Bank. And the UN General Assembly, which has the right to do this, requested the International Court of Justice to provide an opinion as to whether or not the construction of this wall was legal. And in 2004, despite objections from many states, including the United Kingdom, the United States, Israel, many other Western states, the International Court of Justice engaged with the issue as to whether it was legal or not. They also engaged with many other issues which were kind of inherent in the situation, and those included the applicable military law, the applicable human rights law. And they finally said, yes, we do have jurisdiction to consider this question, and they concluded by a majority of 14-1 that the construction of this wall was contrary to international law. And what they said was that the effect of this was that no other state, no other UN state, which almost every single state is a member of the United Nations, should not take any steps to recognise the construction of this wall, and Israel was obliged to reroute the sections of it which were built in occupied territory. There was subsequently a General Assembly resolution concerning the acceptance of this ruling. There wasn't any need for a resolution because, in theory, once the court has set out what the law is certain. It's not dependent on a subsequent resolution from the General Assembly. The General Assembly, by an overwhelming majority, accepted the ruling. It was objected to by, I think, a handful of states, not surprisingly the United States, not surprisingly Israel, and a few allies of the United States. And also, somewhat concerningly, many of the Western states in Europe abstained from the vote. Now, I'd like to move on to draw a little comparison, because I think that might be the type of thing which would be instructive. It's all very well me saying what the principles are and that they're not being implemented. But to what extent have these principles been implemented in relation to the Israel-Palestine situation compared to the former Yugoslavia? Well, within Israel, despite very credible allegations of breaches of even war crimes, there is negligible implementation. There has been absolutely no attempt by the UN Security Council to set up any type of tribunal to consider violations. The United States repeatedly vetoes any type of binding resolution in relation to the situation in the Security Council. And on a domestic level, on one of the levels which I'm familiar with, the United Kingdom has been extremely unwilling to accept any form of universal jurisdiction over suspected Israelis suspected of committing grave breaches of war crimes of the Geneva Conventions. Two cases which I'm quite familiar with are the Almog case and the Zippy Livni case. And in relation to both, despite the credible reports of arrest warrants being issued by a magistrate who'd examined the evidence, in the one case the police refused to issue the arrest warrant and refused to board the plane on which Doron Almog was on. And in relation to Zippy Livni, also there was a huge backlash after the report became public. The government essentially apologised and assured the Israelis that they would change the law to make sure that that type of thing couldn't happen again. And as part of that process, both sides from each country, notably Croats and Serbs, sought to occupy other countries. So in Serbia there were areas which were Croat-controlled, and in Croatia there were areas that were Serbian-controlled. I'm summarising extremely to a great degree, just to point out some of the similarities. There were allegations of war crimes being committed, crimes against humanity, and in relation to that situation, the Security Council intervened. It passed a resolution under Chapter 7, a binding resolution. It authorised the use of military force, eventually authorised the use of a military force on the ground within Yugoslavia, or the area of the former Yugoslavia. It authorised the establishment of a war crimes tribunal. And since then, since the 1990s, the Yugoslav tribunal has been pursuing suspects across the world within the area of the former Yugoslavia. Prosecutions have been brought Convictions have been achieved in a number of different cases. Suspects from the former Yugoslavia have been prosecuted under universal jurisdiction in many other countries, not just the international tribunals. And in relation to the right of return and the borders, although there were a large number of refugees, and although the borders were not as they were at the breakup of as at the time of the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, the UN Security Council and the international community have insisted that the former borders be recognised almost completely. So the boundaries have been put back to pretty much the way they were. There have also been, there have also been strenuous attempts to allow refugees to return to their homes. Now, this hasn't been entirely successful, but in relation to some areas it's been extremely successful. Bosnia, where I used to work, although individuals didn't return to their homes, there has been an almost 100% ability for individuals who were made refugees or forced out of their homes, or even voluntarily left their homes and had their homes taken away from them whilst they were absent. There's been almost 100% implementation of refugees' right to reclaim their homes. So even though they may not have returned to their homes, they have subsequently repossessed their homes and sold them or rented them out or done whatever they want to them. So there's the huge disparity between the two situations. Many conflicts all the world over are very, very similar. Similar things happen. And I'm not saying that necessarily the Israel-Palestine question is one of the worst situations in the world, but it certainly is a situation where there are very clear principles of international law which are not being adhered to. And it compares very unfavourably with many of the other situations where the international community has engaged with the problem and taken steps to implement what are essentially very well recognised principles of international law. So that is a very potted and very brief history. If you're interested, I'm sure you will be able to ask questions or look up the answers. But I hope that gives you a flavour of some of the key issues. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Our next speaker is going to talk to us about what we can do next, what we can do to help. I mean, if I'm allowed to answer this question in one word, looking at all those young faces who are really paying attention tonight, I'll say just use Twitter. You know, use it more effectively. You can bring down governments. I'd like to introduce Dr. Husni Hammuda. Dr. Husni Hammuda is a Palestinian who lives in the UK. He is a renowned public speaker among the Muslim community and an outspoken person on the Palestine issue and the Middle East in general. Please.
Assalamu alaikum wa barakatuh. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know whether it's an asset to be talking towards the end or it is otherwise, because sometimes you can claim, oh, I wanted to say that and they said it already. But then, you know, someone has done your job. Also, I can claim that the topic I'm trying to cover is the most difficult. To say that, you know, what is the solution, what is the way forward for the Palestinian problem is not really an easy question to answer. Nevertheless, I'd like you to draw some pictures in your mind. I'm not going to use laptops, nor do I have a whiteboard. I think, you know, it's like traveling at the speed of light and coming back and believing that you are far in technology compared with people. It's not as if I don't use technology, I do. but I thought I could use a whiteboard, nevertheless. So, the first thing that in 1948, people tried to transfer the Palestinian problem into a problem of refugees. People is expelled from their lands, living in tents near the borders or beyond the borders of Jordan, Lebanon, and so on. So we need to bring food for these people. We need to bring milk for the children, and so on and so forth. That is the problem. Also, think of circles, concentric circles. The middle one is Palestine and the Palestinians. The one outside is the Arabs, because they are the neighbors, or the, if you like, the next of kin to the Palestinians. And then the Muslims, because perhaps the majority of the Palestinians are Muslims, perhaps their brethren, Muslim brothers and sisters, can come to their aid. And then look at the globe, the humanity. Does it have something to say about Palestine? Try to draw this picture. So let us go away from that model of refugees, which I remember earlier on in my life, I heard about refugee camps and so on and so forth. Even when I grew up, there were still a few, even today, in some countries. But we are trying to get away from that model, to bring Palestine back into the international community, with some reservation. I remember a few years back, a friend of mine, Matthew Cunnington, at work, and he said, he was very sympathetic actually, and he said, Husni, what do you like us to do for you? I said, you know, Matthew, can you get off our backs? That was my reaction. Maybe that was about 5 years ago, and if you can think of what was happening in the world, maybe you would have answered the same. So, before we go away from that picture, but please bear it in mind, definitely Palestine came from being an international problem that the international community cared or otherwise for. I would say otherwise, because we need to have both sides of the fence. To living it, perhaps they say, you know, maybe the Muslims can handle this problem. The Mosque of Al-Aqsa is there. It was built 40 years after Mecca. Mecca was built according to religious history. It was the first place of worship on earth to be built. Some say it was built by Adam when he came down on earth. Some say it was built before angels before that. Nevertheless, Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem was built 40 years later. So that was a place of worship that people enjoyed through history, worshipping the Lord. So maybe we can reduce the problem from an international one into an Islamic one. Then, around 20 years ago or so, after several wars, 1948, 1956, 1967, and then 1973, the Arabs may have given up. Say, okay, give it back to its own people. Make it a Palestinian problem. Let the Palestinians take care of it. And then you got all the Oslo Accord and so on and so forth. Now, whether you like it or not, whether it happened with the effort of people, which is always perhaps the case, or the lack of contribution of people, that it came back, it shot from a problem of Palestinians into an Arab problem, into an Islamic problem, into a global problem that people cared about, particularly after incidents such as the flotilla. It brought to the, and of course before that, the war on Gaza. The people saw on live TV stations how this state kills people regardless. 300 children, 1,500 dead, 300 of them are children, women, and so on and so forth. The stories came later on. They bombarded food in stores, schools, and so on and so forth. So you must have an opinion, one way or the other. It is being brought back into being an international problem, going through all the circles from the Palestinian to the Arab, to the Islamic, to the worldwide attention, worldwide international community attention. That is one picture. There's also, if you are familiar with company organizations, maybe you can think of a box at the top with a name in it. 2 boxes after that. And then 7 boxes and so on. The box on the top is my grandfather. The 2 boxes after that are my parents. Then there are 7 boxes that these are their children, including myself. And then there is maybe 24 boxes, grandchildren, as well as, I don't know, 15, or I need to check. Because the great-grandchildren are actually coming, you know, not individually, but maybe sometimes by the 2 and 3. There are around 50 people in that one family, and my parents are still alive. They are all outside Palestine. This organization, if you like, or family tree, they need to go back. The one on the top is not there anymore because he was killed in 1948 in cold blood and thrown in a hole with other people and buried. The other picture I want you to imagine is Palestine, which is a very nice shape, and then what happened to Palestine through the last at least in the last 62 years. Because Palestine, actually, what's going on in Palestine started around 100 years or so, with the British mandate and encouraging people to immigrate and so on and so forth, encouraging Jews from Europe and other parts of the world to immigrate, etc., etc., etc. So how to bring that whole country that was in one piece, and now it is getting fragmented by the day. And reverse that process. So we have a few processes to be reversed, if you like. Now, when I talk about solution, each group, there is a saying which says, كُلُّكُمْ رَاعٍ وَكُلُّكُمْ مَسْئُولٌ عَنْ رَعِيَّتِهِ. Every one of you is a shepherd and responsible for what you are looking after. You could be looking after a family, you could be looking after a firm, you could be looking after yourself, and so on. So individuals have different capacity to contribute if they wanted to. And also, if you think back of the circles, what you expect from a Palestinian who is inside is different from what you expect from a Palestinian in exile, like ourselves. different from what you expect from the neighboring Arab countries and individuals, and probably different from what I expect from my colleagues and audience from the rest of the world. Another aspect, I'm not really here to talk on behalf of political organizations, nor do I talk on behalf of organizations that are trying to find a solution. I am talking to individuals, because at you where it starts, and at you where you are, it ends. No matter what the people trying to do around you, it is you who make that contribution, and it is you who will or shall benefit from such contribution. The first item which I can think of is definitely education, which my colleagues preceded me in doing. And of course, I'm not here to talk about the specifics of Palestine and what happened in the history, but remind you that unless you know what you are dealing with, it is very difficult to see where you can contribute. And as they say, judging a matter is a branch from imagining it. If I tell you how can you build a house, and you can think of a house as this, you think this is a house in your mind, then that's what you're going to do. That is, as far as you are concerned, this is the house. It has 4 legs and so on and so forth, and it comes in different colors and different padding. So you need to understand what we are talking about and to listen. Definitely you will be listening to varying views. There's nothing wrong with that. You need to understand the history of the place, particularly the last 100 years. And I don't know if the lawyer is
He's had to leave.
He had to leave. I had a couple of questions. Because, you know, does the law recognize what happened before 1948? Because it only recognizes what happened after. So what about before 1948? How does the law see Palestine before that time? Or does time start at 1948 and before it doesn't? Maybe that's an interesting question we need to answer. But definitely knowing the history of Palestine, particularly the last 100 years, and of course brief history before, is very helpful indeed. We also need to understand the geography from education point of view. Where is that place? How does it look like? What did it look like 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 30 years ago, and what does it look like today? And why? Why is it changing, if at all it is changing? We need also to understand the political history behind Palestine, particularly Zionism. How does Zionism come into this? How does religion come into this? What does different religions say about that? Briefly, I'm not saying in anything complicated. We also need to understand the war history. There is a history of wars. And you can go 100 years ago, but you can also go beyond that. You can go to the time of Salah ad-Din and what happened in that place. Is there any resemblance in the situation between that time and today? Who is behind what? And who is doing what function in the whole conflict? This can only attain through education, learning, and so on. And with internet, you know, it is not really that difficult at all, provided interest is there. I'm not really talking about everything, I'm just giving hints. I would say that, with all respect to older people like me and above, I would say young people need to be more interested. Because you have more time. Statistically, you do have more time.
Few minutes.
Few more minutes?
Few minutes, if you...
Okay, the second point is that once you have an opinion, you need to propagate that opinion. I would say you play part of that education. And I could say expose. You know, it depends how subtle you'd like to be. But you like also to expose or to propagate the education. You can talk about continuous land confiscation, settlement, apartheid, wars, embargoes, policies against the Palestinians, and so on and so forth. You can talk about specifics. You can take Gaza. Again, we don't want Palestine to be integrated in one place or one group. We want to bring it back to what it was before and talk about it from that viewpoint. But you can take examples. What's happening in Gaza? Why? Why it is under siege? Not only by the Hebrew state, but also by the international community. Is that in accordance with the law? What was demolished during the war on Gaza in 2008-2009 was not rebuilt because cement and all building material is prohibited to go there. Why? We need to support and that is my last point, if you allow me just to support when you say support, again, I don't want to go to that model of UNICEF. UNICEF that brought milk to the refugees in 1948 and beyond. That is not really what I think. Although, of course, you need to give all kinds of support. I would say financial support, of course. But the support, the objectives of the support should be for the Palestinians to get all their rights back. So whatever support you think of, you need to think of the ultimate goal rather than the partial goal which you are thinking of. The use of media is very powerful in all of that. You don't have to own a TV station or a satellite station, etc., although there are a few around. However, the use of emails, websites, Facebook, etc., blogs and so on, we have seen that recently brought governments down by the will of God. Also, during the flotilla, by the way, there was an internet streaming from the ship to the internet, and we were actually following it up. Although things can be blocked officially, but they could not block that media, and people saw what was happening. We need to have financial support to the Palestinians. We need to have the legal actions against war criminals and so on, like my colleague mentioned. We need, if they have embargo on Gaza, then we need to boycott the Israeli products. We need to use the same as they are using. And also we need to get involved in activities, in demos, in convoys that are going there. We should physically contribute in that effect. Politically, we need to make our governments aware. Again, I would go to my very first point. Sometimes I feel that maybe governments do not want that to be solved. They do not have the right weight. Even the United States, when it came to settlement, just to freeze settlement for a period of time, they came back, we cannot do it. Then what can you do? If you are on this side, like me, looking, see if the United States cannot impose that for things to happen, for so-called the peace agreement to reach its ultimate goal, what can they do? If they cannot do, you can do. Thank you very much indeed.
My question is, I feel this has not been addressed, and this is the reason why the Jewish nation has the support of many countries, and especially evangelical Christians, that the Jewish people have a divine right to return to Israel with Jerusalem as its eternal undivided capital. And my other question, it's very brief, is how come the Arab world is not being lobbied to play a more assertive role? Because the Jewish nation knows that it has the unwavering support of Israel. The Jewish nation has a professional military. The Jewish nation is investing in science and technology, while the Arab nations are just building the world's biggest shopping malls and glitzy buildings. And I don't begrudge that, but I feel that they need to play a more united role. Oh, and the Jewish nation know that the Arab world is divided and the Arab leaders are suspicious of each other. So what can we do to lobby Arab governments to take a united stand? And I'm sure then the US will take note, because we live in a very interdependent world, and oil money is very influential.
Maybe some people here will ask why we should care about the Palestinian issues. We are maybe living in the UK, and why we should care about the Palestinian issues, and why we should care about the solutions for the Palestinian issues. I'll just give two very, very, very short points. First of all, the Palestinian issue does affect all the world, and most of the wars in the world are because of the Palestinian issue. One example is the Iraqi war, and the UK sent its soldiers there to be killed because to protect Israel. And the second thing is the moral issue. How can I, as a father, living in Guildford, my children are sleeping all night, having a breakfast ready in the morning, while in the Gaza Strip, children there don't have food, they don't sleep all night because they have post-traumatic stress disorders, they wait in the bed because of the bombings. That's a moral issue. So we should all care as humans, and also to protect ourselves and our children and stop the wars in the world because of Israel.
But basically, what is the ideal outcome, and what happens to the Jews that are living there at the moment? What is the Palestinian ideal? Again?
I think the first question was referring to the religious background of the conflict, if you like, coming from the Jewish religion background, as well as the support of some Christians. First of all, I would say that with the same token, you have an Islamic viewpoint on the matter, just as strong, believing in that land, defending that land, and the mosque on it. That's one thing. The second is that not all the Jews agree with that, if you like, side of the story of analysis. And not all the Christians definitely supporting, some Jews believe that it is actually prohibited for them to go back to Palestine, and that would be the end of the Jews if they do. So my answer is clear. There is an opposing Islamic viewpoint believed by billions 1.5 billion Muslims, more or less. That viewpoint is not really supported by all the Jews, nor is it supported by all the Christians. The second is the Arab involvement, and this is something which I tried to, when I said imagine these circles, and how the Palestinian cause came down from being an international concern and interest for the international community to becoming a problem of a refugee, that you need to give a milk to the child and a piece of bread to the boy and some meal to the others. So I'm saying that that was part of the problem, is that is particularly in the last 30 years or so. And what's happening, if I can link it to the brother who mentioned Egypt, I believe that one of the supplementary reasons in the minds of these young people who came to the Liberation Square, to Tahrir Square, that they saw Egypt that had a key role, not only within the Arab world and the Muslim world, but Egypt, through history, had an international role to play, to be reduced to such a state that Egypt is building a wall to stop these tunnels, is doing this, is doing the other, is going to Tel Aviv, Omar Suleiman, to discuss how they can stop the weapons and so on to be passed on to the people, and so on. People may not express that there and then, but the accumulation of that story led to that uprising, which is eventually is one of the greatest revolutions in history, I would say. Even in the U.S. revolution, 200,000 people were the core of the revolution, and the population at that time was around 200. So it was 1 to 1,000, and that was a great revolution. Now you see 8, 9 million people, which is more than 1 in 10. Definitely it was a real revolution. It was a peaceful revolution, and that is going to change what the brother has said about the involvement of the Arabs. If Egypt is back to play its role, then the rest of the Arabs will follow suit. So that is more or less.
Well, I would like just to comment on the very first question about the Jewish right of return. I guess let's be clear about it. Let's go back to history. Let's study the books of history for a short time, not for educational purposes, but for general knowledge. There's nothing called the right of return for the Jews. Although the Jewish people or the Israeli state is trying to establish a history, there is nothing like kind of contiguous Jewish history. All the Jewish groups that have even lived across Europe and the Middle East, they were sporadic, a group of Jewish people, they were not united. There's no real bond. This is number one. Number two, there's no real linkage or direct link between those Jews and Palestine. Could you tell me, like, how come a very blunt Jewish from Poland, Ukraine, or Russia has a link with Palestine? I might accept that, like a Jewish from the other part, this Fardim, who's an Eastern Jewish, like he has some link. Okay, maybe his ancestors lived in the East or like came to Palestine in a certain stage. Maybe he has some kind of link. But I cannot accept that all the Jews worldwide have kind of link with Palestine. Although, as I told you earlier, we are the ones who were ethnically cleansed. We are the ones who were driven out of their lands. We are the ones who lost their villages, their towns, their homes, and etc. We are the ones who have only the right to return, not the Jews. The Jews were living in Europe, they were living in peace within these countries. And I don't want to be anti-Semite here. If some pro-Israel people would hear me, they will say that I'm anti-Semite, and I've been accused many times of being anti-Semite. But tonight I'll be clear about it. There is nothing called the right of return. The right of return for the Jews should be implemented in a reverse way, which is back to Europe. It's their country, it's the countries that have accommodated for them, and these countries should accommodate them again. It's not our problems, it's their problem. They've had many problems with these countries in the past, and I guess they should return back to end what is going on now. This is what I have in my pocket.
Okay, thank you. By Belfort. Again, it would be very interesting to understand the legal viewpoint of that, but definitely a country somewhere in the world cannot give a nation another country elsewhere. So even I, with my very basic understanding of law, that does not make sense. And as the poet says, تعد الوعود وتقتضي إنجازها مهج العباد خسئت يا مستعمر عد من تشاء بما تشاء فإنما دعواك خاسرة ووعدك أخسر. Belfort is given something that he does not own, and that what is the poet is saying, that you are giving something which you do not own, and it caused the bloodshed and agony of other nations. Just before I finish, I just want to say to the people who are supporting that idea of returning to Palestine so as the Messiah will appear and so on and so forth, I would actually ask the West, you know, the Europeans and the Americans and so on, to think of what happened during the Crusades. They tried it before. There was there before. There was a lot of bloodshed over more than 100 years. Eventually they left. Why trying it again and again and again? With a loss, not only within the people, say the Palestinians and the people in the Middle East, but also a great loss in lives, a great loss in income and so on for the West. Why should your governments support Israel to the death? You should question your governments. You should ask, why? And then you say, why terrorism? Why this? Why that? And say, oh, you shouldn't be linking. What do you mean? If someone steals, you go and see, and if he's poor, from a poor area, you say, that's the problem. If there is a problem on prostitution, again, you look why. If there is a child abuse problem, you look beyond it. But then when you have a problem and say, oh, no, don't link it to anything. We're not condoning an action, but we are looking behind that action. Ask your governments. It has been tried before. Do not try it again. Thank you very much.